Welcome back to our special coverage of the federal budget, which included some big ticket items, including a plan to spend $30 billion over 5 years on childcare and early learning and $101.4 billion over 3 years to kickstart the economy. The Primetime panel is back to talk about some of this spending. James Moore, Shachi Kurl, and Professor Lindsay Tedds. Professor Tedds, I'll start with you on this one because you had been part of the task force talking about what might come in this budget when it concerns childcare. Is what was outlined today generally what you expected and what you think will be effective?
Well, for the most part, this is a bigger commitment to early learning childhood education by the federal government than anybody expected. We're ramping up to about $9 billion a year by the end of the 5 years. And so, it is quite significant. What I think is quite disappointing is that it was all in on subsidized childcare spaces and neglecting the fact that there are actually a significant number of families who work non-standard hours or have non-standard needs, and they are left out of this spending. The childcare expense deduction has not been changed, and it does not serve lower income families at all. So anybody not able to get into one of these subsidized spots is really left out of the cold.
James, does that create any kind of political opening for opposition parties?
No question. And add to that, adding on to the list of grievances about this proposed program, also Canadians who live in rural and remote communities who don't necessarily have access to these kinds of facilities. I mean, this has been a long-standing debate in this area of public policy for a long time. We're the second largest country in the world in size, but 37th largest in terms of population. We are a spread out country, and the idea that you can mandate universal access across this vast country when it's actually also a provincial jurisdiction is hugely problematic. Second, the federal government's coming to the table with a chunk of money, but they're demanding a 50-50 formula with the provinces. Where have we heard that before? Well, we heard that before with healthcare. And how's that working out a generation later, 2 generations later, where the 50-50 formula has been failed by not the provinces, but by the federal government, and with rapidly escalating costs of healthcare. And by the way, healthcare didn't receive a dime of new money in this budget beyond what was already announced, which is just an escalator that was already assumed. So there's no new money for healthcare, but there's new money on the table on a 50-50 formula if negotiated the way that Ottawa wants it. So the long-term costs that are going to be shouldered by provinces who don't have the taxing ability, who don't have access to Bank of Canada capital and options, is going to be a massive debt burden for provinces to shoulder. And there's only one taxpayer in this country. So this is an interesting promise, has to be negotiated with the provinces. And I think what Minister Freeland will find is that negotiating with the premiers across this country is going to be a lot harder than negotiating with Donald Trump on a reformed NAFTA.
Shachi, let me ask you from a kind of politically crass perspective. Who are the Liberals speaking to with this promise, though? Because, women have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, left out of the workforce and unable to return. That's a fact. We know that. But politically, there's obviously a policy conversation that can take place about how to address that. Who are they speaking to right now?
Sure, and there's a wedge there, absolutely. So adding even further to that list of grievances around this particular plan, what we also see and what you're going to hear is criticism around choice and the best way parents want to make choices around caring for their children. So when you look at parents who are staying at home, where it's one parent who's a caregiver in the home with their child or children under the age of 6, we know this from studies we've done, the most recent that came out in early March, there's a lot of nuance there. A lot of at-home parents are actually very happy with that arrangement. It's an arrangement in many circumstances that has been chosen for them or has defaulted because options weren't available. But in many cases, it's a conscious choice. And so when you see overall broad support for better, more affordable, good quality childcare in this country, I mean, that's something that you see a vast majority of Canadians agree on. What they don't agree on, where there is less consensus on how that should be implemented. So should it just be subsidized childcare spaces? Should it be direct credits to parents in the home for them to either bring in help or to find other ways to make that money useful? So that's another big political wedge watch for it to be exploited. You already heard the opposition leader, Erin O'Toole, speak to that a little bit today. And it will be one, I think, that you're going to hear some of the premiers, particularly from some of the western provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, really speak to, because there is, without a doubt, a divide on which side of the political spectrum you're on when you're asked the question about the best way to implement better affordable childcare.
That promise is just one promise, Professor Teds, about how the government plans to spend the money that it has allocated over the next 3 years towards stimulus and other programs. That figure, $101.4, I think it is, $billion over 3 years. Lots of back and forth politically about whether it's too much, whether it's being spent in the right places. What's your overall headline or takeaway from the stimulus spending that the government has promised?
Well, my overlying headline is that a lot of this isn't stimulus, it's actually recovery. And a big part of what they're focusing on is actually removing barriers to economic participation of people who have, in fact, been left out of economic growth in the past. We're looking at supporting women to get back into the labor force. We're supporting jobs for racialized women and low-wage workers. We're supporting training and businesses of racialized businesses. So I think we have to take a moment here to sort of understand that the economic growth that we've had in the past has predominantly benefited a certain class of people. Now we're talking about trying to dismantle more barriers to make sure that everybody is able to reap the spoils of the economy. So that's how I would frame it. I would not be framing this necessarily as stimulus, particularly as we're seeing that the economy seems to be roaring back in a bit of an unexpected way.
So, James, let me ask you about that, and in particular, how that affects the political positioning of opposition parties again, because there was conversation in the lead up to this budget about whether that amount of money would be necessary because of some of the big economic indicators, which, of course, I've reiterated many times throughout the show tonight, aren't necessarily being felt by a lot of Canadians right now who are left out of the workforce, who are negatively impacted financially in a big way, small business owners, for example, a whole host of others. At the same time, it's not like things are necessarily as bad when you look at growth or the amount of savings people have as we might have anticipated they would be 6 months ago. And that led to that conversation. Is it necessary that they spend this much? When you listen to the way in which Professor Teds frames it, though, how hard does it make it for opposition parties trying to make the counter argument?
It's not necessary. It's a choice, but it's a choice that it is all about the nature of how we should live with one another, which is what governing is all about. How should we live together as Canadians? And so these are fundamental questions that should be debated in Parliament, debated around kitchen tables, and debated in election campaigns. But is it necessary? It's not. This is a choice by a government that has a strategic imperative to try to squish out the room on the left from the NDP, which they've effectively done with this budget and previous budgets as well, to go down the road of incredible record spending that we've never seen before. I mean, just the cost of, and according to the government's own numbers, the cost of servicing the debt right now is approaching $40 billion per year. $40 billion. Parliamentary budget office said that a national childcare program would cost $11 to $12 billion per year for it to be effective. So that's the scale of indebtedness that we're facing right here by virtue of choices that are not because of COVID. COVID has exposed challenges in our economy and in our society, as was just mentioned by the professor. There are a lot of ways to tackle that. Ramping up massive deficits that are going to have to be paid for by future generations is not the only option for the government. The age-old promise of politicians of saying you can have a dollar's worth of government for 60 cents and we'll just throw the rest on the shoulders of our kids for the future, with the assumption that interest rates will never go up, with the assumption that we won't have another pandemic, or we won't have a national security crisis, or we won't have a natural disaster, is in the end reckless government.
Shachi, I just have a little bit of time left, but to counter that, again, I anticipate that, for example, the Liberals will say, okay, fine, that's the criticism from the Conservatives, but we feel like those inequalities that have come to surface, that people being left out of the economic fold, are worthy of this kind of spending, are worthy of these kinds of investments. And I just wonder, among Canadians, how you navigate that argument, right? Like you can say we oppose that level of spending, but like if you agree that those Canadians were disproportionately impacted, what are you going to do for them?
Right. And so therein lies the rub. Both narratives are true or truthy in that this has been an extraordinary time that has revealed a lot of gaps and left a lot of people behind. And the Liberals will go out and attempt to sell this budget and communicate this budget as one that is addressing a lot of underlying inequalities and problems that have been neglected for too long. The other truth, however, is that future kids don't vote. People vote in the here and now. They're focused often on the here and now and making the case around, well, this is going to affect us, me, you, unborn children, unborn nieces and nephews in 30 years or 20 years or in a shorter time frame than that, will be challenging. But it's also true and cogent that at some point, this is going to have to be reined back in. At some point, the spendy times will have to come to an end, and there will be a reckoning in that case. So, now this is a period of time where I said, at the beginning, Canadians are going to have to make up their minds. It will take them some listening, and this is where the politicians go to work trying to sell and spin those messages.
Everybody's facial expressions shows me we could talk about this for a lot longer because there's lots of various points of view. Unfortunately, my show's about to end in about a minute, so I have to leave it there. I want to thank all three of you for joining us tonight and sharing your perspectives. Appreciate it as always. James Moore-Shachi-Curl and Professor Lindsay Tedds. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.